What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are wrapping up stories that we started and never had a chance to finish. As always, make sure you guys subscribe and drop a like if you're enjoying the content. And so let's get into it with the conclusion of Venom Volume 1. Now, this is really a cool story, right? This is one of the things I love about this conclusion, is that what this does is it actually focuses on Meridius. Now, it's been a while since we covered Venom, so don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging, I'm not going to leave you confused about what's going on. We'll make sense of everything. But one of the things that you guys will notice here, and we talked about this in the previous video, is that Meridius basically had an agenda that was not fully fleshed out. We don't really know what this guy's motivation is. All we know is he basically showed up in the present day from the far-flung future and essentially created a symbiote out of himself named Bedlam, and then in turn released Bedlam into the world with the intention of going after Eddie Brock's son, Dylan. And that's one of the things to keep in mind here, is that in the aftermath of the King in Black story, that Eddie Brock had basically bonded with all of the symbiotes. He had become a King in Black, meaning he can control all the different symbiotes that exist across the universe, and he would use them to basically fight crime or to deal with major calamities and things like that across the universe itself, like having his own universe-wide personal army. But the thing behind this is that what it did is it left his son Dylan Brock back on Earth largely feeling abandoned and alone, and so that seems to be part of the scheme of Meridius. But what's more intriguing here is that following him unleashing the Bedlam symbiote onto Earth, he basically travels back to his own time, and when he gets there, it's just this enormous garden that exists, but he also ends up finding the body of Eddie Brock, which has emerged in this island. Now, that's one of the things to remember, is that there was a point in the previous stories that we did when Dylan was visited by what seemed to be Eddie Brock, who basically told him, we have to pack, we have to get out of here, right? We're gonna go to a motel, and then we're gonna get things sorted from there, right? Like, people are after me again, or something along those lines. And where Dylan had actually called Eddie Brock, that basically led to Eddie saying, yes, go to the motel, but do not bond with the symbiote. The implication being that it was Dylan who was talking to the symbiote in the house, and it was actually Eddie Brock that he was talking to on the phone. But at the end of the day, Eddie Brock, the physical, real, tangible Eddie Brock, was destroyed when the motel exploded. And so because he was basically dead, this is where he washed up at. This is where his body showed up at, where he basically meets with Meridius. Now, the cool thing about this is that as they're walking through, and that's really kind of all you need to know for at least this next little bit of a story, but as they're walking through this place, Eddie Brock has all kinds of questions, like what in the world is this place? And what we're told is that this is referred to as the Garden of Time, and it was given that name by seemingly Meridius and named after a guy named Ballard who had written a story about a man who controlled time, but who could not turn back what was coming, basically stop some kind of an apocalypse that was supposed to be coming to their doors. And what he effectively says here is that this place that they're in, this Garden of Time, is basically at the very end of time. It's the last of all things. The only things that wait for them are quite literally the cosmic entities Oblivion and Entropy, the end of basically everything. But then Eddie Brock starts to pick up on the general look of this place and the general feel of this place, and comes to the realization that it's all synthetic. And that's when Meridius is like, yes, this is what the symbiote hive mind becomes. That unlike in your time in 2022, where the symbiote hive mind is basically just a whole bunch of symbiotes that can communicate with each other, in this time here at the end of everything, the symbiotes are basically dormant. They're effectively sleeping. But because of the power that people like you and I possess, we can reshape the symbiotes without waking them up and turn them into virtually anything we want to. And that makes sense. That actually makes perfect sense, because while we didn't necessarily see Venom do it all that often, if at all, there are symbiotes out there that can shapeshift. And the reality here is that if one symbiote can shapeshift, all symbiotes can shapeshift. Either they don't know that they can do it, or they just simply haven't done it yet. But whatever the reason is, symbiotes can physically become anything. They are a sort of amorphous blob that takes the form of a kind of goo that bonds itself to a person, but they can look or be basically anything they want to. Now, when the question is asked by Eddie Brock, how did this thing get to the way that it was? The response of Meridius is, I shaped it, right? I took this sort of symbiote hive mind and I shaped it to make it look this way. Basically, I'm the reason that it is. And the result of this is Eddie comes to the realization that Meridius can quite literally plug into the symbiote hive mind. Now, the last time that Eddie Brock saw anybody do that, it was the actual King in Black, right? Like the being who created the symbiotes in the first place. That's the last time he saw anybody who was able to tangibly plug into the hive mind and control it. And that's what he asks him. He's like, so like, are you Knull? Are you you like some future version of Knull, the symbiote god? And the response of Meridius is no, but I am a king in black, as are you. You are definitively a king in black of the Venom symbiotes. Now, this is kind of a funny thing here because this sort of requires us to know what had come before in order to understand what's going on now. And like we said earlier, when Eddie Brock had basically taken over, I guess, the governing, or he ruled all the symbiotes after the destruction and the death of Knull, that's what turned him into the king in black. So at the time when that story concluded, we treated it as more of like a ceremonial title, like Steve Rogers becoming Captain America, Odin's son becoming Thor, that kind of a thing. The reality here is that's not the case, that it is a title that's given to him, but it's given to him by virtue of being the person who's able to control all the symbiotes in existence, and that's what makes him the king in black. Not only that, there are other kings in black that exist as well. One of the things that we're told, for example, is that there's somebody named Wild who becomes a king in black after Eddie Brock, presumably after Eddie Brock actually dies, like he just dies of old age or whatever the case is. And in fact, there is another person named Tyro who becomes a king in black after Wild. So basically it's one of these things where even after Eddie Brock dies, and presumably Dylan dies as well, that somebody else ends up taking over the role of controlling all the symbiotes in existence across the universe. And it just literally becomes a line of succession. Now, how those people are chosen, we're not entirely sure. We don't know if it's some kind of a calamity, if it's that the Venom symbiote basically ends up losing its host, like Eddie Brock, who dies for whatever reason. It bonds himself to Wild, and then Wild becomes a new king in black. Wild dies, and then the Venom symbiote bonds itself to Tyro. We don't even know if it's the Venom symbiote. It's one of the things to keep in mind here is that because Venom's kind of always been the star when it came to the symbiotes in Marvel Comics, that the Venom symbiote kind of seems to be the one that leads, sort of like the top symbiote, the field commander, if you want to call it that. But it's just one of those things where we're kind of given this explanation that there are more people out there like Eddie Brock who take over control of the symbiotes and who wield insurmountable amounts of power. Now, this is where things get a little bit murky, and the reason why is because as Eddie and Meridius continue this conversation and he's introducing him to everybody else, Meridius says, and this Eddie, as you guessed, Wild. He's a king as well, who obviously came here the same way that you did. And that's when you basically have this statement that's chimed in where they say, he means by unshackling your mind from the flow of time. And we don't really get any more of an explanation other than that. I mean, we kind of do to a degree, in the sense that Meridius says, like, I apologize for them interrupting like that. I do try to teach those who wash up here to navigate the currents of time, but mostly so they leave me alone. It can be frustrating. We're all kings, but that doesn't make us friends. The reason why this matters, and the reason why we don't really get any more of an explanation for that, is because suddenly, like, the Bedlam symbiote shows up, and we'll talk about him here in a second. But the thing behind this, and the way they phrase it here, washing up in this location, you don't hear them saying things like, he got here the same way you did, Meridius brought you here. Instead, what seems to go on is that whenever a person becomes a king in black, regardless of how long they were a king in black, they basically seem to show up here when they die. The most obvious question to ask in relation to that statement is, well, then where is Knull, the symbiote god? And I don't have an answer to that question. I don't know the answer to that question. And that's why I say this is purely speculation. It's one of the things Al Ewing does. Al Ewing will, like, give you a piece of information and then leave it. And then, like, suddenly the tables will turn, or some of it will transpire, and you'll just kind of be left asking that question, wait, I need to know this. But he's going to tie into it later on. In the midst of this conversation, basically the Bedlam symbiote shows up here. Not only that, but we're met by the arrival of another king in black named Finnegan. Now, the arrival of Finnegan basically heralds the arrival of Bedlam, in the sense that we're not given a whole lot of information about Bedlam. And because Bedlam is a king in black, what it looks like, or at least that seems to be the case, what it looks like is basically Meridius had summoned Bedlam from potentially this location to Earth when he initially unleashed him on Earth. Now, again, we don't really know the ins and outs of Bedlam. All we simply know is that the symbiote is basically just here. So it could be that it's just a symbiote and not a king in black. But the reason why I say the arrival of Finnegan basically means the arrival of Bedlam is because Bedlam hates Finnegan. Quite literally, Bedlam absolutely hates Finnegan. And in fact, a fight breaks out between the two, or really it's more Bedlam intending to eat Finnegan. Now, of course, Eddie Brock jumps in and Eddie Brock attacks Bedlam. And that's when you get this little bit of a statement by Meridius when he's initially asked, like, are you going to step in? His response is like, it doesn't really matter. And what seems to be the case here is that nobody in this realm can actually really die. That if Eddie Brock was seemingly destroyed, he would would basically be reborn in some capacity. We don't necessarily know. Again, we're not definitively given an answer here. What we are told, though, is that despite everything that we've ever seen Eddie Brock do over the course of Marvel Comics, none of it matters in relation to the power of Bedlam. Bedlam absolutely crushes Venom. I mean, literally rips his arm off, like just overpowers this guy, and he never really had a chance in the first place. And that's the thing, like you have this statement where Meridius is like, God, look at those cavemen go, right? And even when he's asked, like, you know, why don't you just step in? Like, why don't you break up all this stuff? The response of Meridius is, why should I, right? We're kings in black, minds without bodies, in a garden of bodies without minds. Let the gods splatter. If that's how Bedlam wants to ease his tensions, it won't hurt anybody. So again, this seems to hit to the idea that none of them can actually die here. That because they are basically minds, right, they take on a kind of physical form of their own, that when Eddie Brock's mind arrived here, it was not actually a physical body. Instead, he basically manifested a physical body out of the symbiote matter that already existed here. So if Bedlam just consumes and destroys Eddie Brock, all it's gonna do is just destroy a physical body, and Eddie Brock's mind will simply reform a new one, and everything will be fine. That's basically just how things go. Now, of course, while Eddie Brock is facing off against Bedlam, Finnegan basically tells him, no, it's cool, man. Just go ahead and attack him, right? Go ahead and kill him. Now, the crazy thing about this is that Finnegan had tried to tell Eddie Brock something before he was immediately attacked by Bedlam. But when this happens, Finnegan basically tells Bedlam, go ahead and kill Eddie Brock, right? That's fine. And of course, Eddie's sort of taken by surprise, but with Bedlam realizing Finnegan's still there, Bedlam grabs Finnegan, he basically destroys him, or at least jumps up into the sky, and seems to kill him. Now, that's the kicker here, is because one of the statements that's made by these guys who are here, at least when they're talking to Meridius, is they point out this idea that the truth of this situation is that Meridius is trapped here just like they are. So while we could look at this as potentially being a kind of afterlife for those individuals who bond to a symbiote and then go on to become a king in black, that it actually looks like it's more of a prison. But we don't really know what all's going on here. We don't know if it's one of these things where Marvel's going to pan out and it's going to turn out to be some snow globe or something like that, right? We don't really know what's going on with this situation, and things are incredibly murky. But the important thing here is that with all of this unfolded, it was really Al Ewing kind of giving us a perspective of what could go on, or what does go on, with regards to Meridius and like the other kings in black, and how Eddie Brock fits into it all. And so ultimately, Meridius basically just leaves. And one of the things he does is he just kind of muses to himself, where he actually ends up kind of going back in time, going back by a few hours or so, and even just sort of observing things. But he comes to this realization that the reality here is he needs to ensure that Eddie Brock comes here. And the reason why, and what's really interesting here, is that historically speaking in Marvel Comics, they treat the future as an absolute thing until it's not. So for example, if you look at the X-Men, the events of Days of Future Past, when the Sentinel program was reactivated by humans who were basically terrified of mutants, that the Sentinels had taken over the entirety of North America, and they enslaved both humans and mutants. That was a guaranteed future outcome. That was going to happen until you basically had Kitty Pryde who went into the past and prevented Days of Future Past from happening, and then the future went back to any number of possibilities, right? It jumped to whatever the next calamity was going to be. So the point that I'm making here is that in Marvel, futures are basically guaranteed until something comes along that stops that potential future from happening, and then it becomes more fluid again. And so the reason why this is important is because in this moment, Meridius knows that Eddie Brock shows up here in the Garden of Time, right? Seemingly the end of all things for those individuals who are kings in black. But any number of things could happen that could result in that not happening, right? Any number of things could take place that could result in Eddie Brock not dying in that hotel. Maybe he calls Dylan partway through and says, actually, let's meet somewhere else. Maybe something happens and he's called away and he ends up just never showing up to the motel. Any number of things could take place. So in order to ensure that happens, and this is where things again get a little murky here, Meridius basically goes back to the past and impersonates Eddie Brock. So when we saw that symbiote emerge in the house of Eddie where Dylan was staying, and we thought, well, maybe it was this symbiote, or maybe it's somebody else that we're not fully aware of, it was Meridius. It was Meridius impersonating Eddie Brock and telling Dylan, we have to go to a motel. Now that's the power this guy possesses, and that's something that I hope you're starting to pick up on. That basically Meridius is someone out there who was possessed by a symbiote and then seemingly became the last king in black, that there are no other king in blacks after him, and that he has completely and totally mastered. He's literally spent 10,000 2,000 years mastering the abilities of the symbiotes. He is potentially even more powerful than Knull the symbiote god, and that in his ability to master the symbiotes and master the Garden of Time, he's also learned how to master traveling back and forth through the time stream. And that's why this place basically seems to be a trap, is because he even had told Eddie, like, you can go home once you learn to navigate the time stream, and Meridius has done that, yet he still can't escape the Garden of Time. He seems to basically be irrevocably stuck there. He can't, quote unquote, go home, if we wanted to call it that. So again, that's why I kind of look at it as more of a prison than anything else. But literally he does this because he wants to ensure that whatever plan he's concocting comes to fruition. We don't really know the details of that plan, but we know that it does involve ensuring that Eddie Brock dies in front of Dylan, and that Dylan, in his anger and his rage, by not only having been abandoned by his father when he took off into space to become a superhero and manage all the symbiotes across the universe, but that he now feels permanently abandoned by his father because basically Eddie Brock died before he had a chance to really spend much time with Dylan, that based on the comics that we've read so far, it fills Dylan with a lot of rage and a lot of anger, not just towards Eddie, but towards the world itself. And it even permeates into the Venom symbiote. And so it's one of those things where, as Meridius is downstairs listening to Dylan call Eddie Brock, the question that he sort of poses here, and this is a real mind bender, is he poses the question, is it actually Eddie Brock that Dylan is talking to? Or is it Meridius who's pretending to be Eddie Brock from some point where he travels back to that moment in time in order to ensure that Dylan actually goes to the motel? Because remember, he's trying to make sure that these events unfold exactly the way that they're supposed to. And that's why I say things are a little murky, because Al Ewing doesn't really give us an explanation here. Al Ewing doesn't tell us if everything that transpired up to the moment when Eddie Brock showed up on the shore of the Garden of Time, if that just happened organically without anybody intervening in any capacity. It's just the way things progress over the course of that period of time, and that Meridius is going back here and ensuring things progress that way, or if things happen that way because Meridius went back in time, right? Like, we don't know if that's the case, and Al Ewing doesn't really give us an answer. It's just kind of left to us to hypothesize, or to maybe just even keep it in the back of our head just to see what happens. But the significant thing here, and what seems to be the overarching plan of Meridius, is to basically get his hands on the symbiote, which is kind of interesting, because even when he says, like, with everything that's happening here, that ultimately the Venom symbiote will shed its name just like virtually anything else does, and on that day we will be Venom. And so what this looks like is, we can interpret it a couple different ways. Either this is actually Dylan Brock in the far-flung future, this is what Dylan becomes, this just ultra powerful symbiote character, maybe it's somebody that has nothing to do with Dylan. And it's also potential here that the Venom symbiote is wholly unique among all the other symbiotes and is arguably the most powerful. And so the goal of Meridius is to actually attain the Venom symbiote for himself, and then essentially do whatever it is that he ends up doing, which, judging by this look on his face where he's all just, you know, kind of crazy looking, maybe it's horrifying, right? Maybe he already has the Venom symbiote and he's just guaranteeing his own future. Again, it's the nature of Al Ewing. We don't definitively know, but we will find out as time goes on. So with that being said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. Thank you all for watching, and I will catch you all later. Peace.